Morning there. Morning all. Well, we are into week 2 and this is our corporate finance module for BABS. And week 2 today is 15th September. Today we're going to be looking at some topics within corporate finance, corporate governance, how the business funds itself. Initially, we're going to look at that. The corporate environment in general, corporate governance, how the business runs itself, and corporate social responsibility and ESG. So, as I say, this is our second class, and we're in the room here, and there's some folks joining online. So, topics I want to talk about today. We're just going to recap on what we talked about at the end of last week, because we will be looking at this in future weeks. Financial management decisions. So what steps are involved in these financial management decisions? Just recap quickly as well on some topics we talked about at the end of the class last week. The goals of not-for-profit organizations, because when we get moving on next week onwards and getting into the investment appraisal area, we're going to talk really about for-profit businesses, private businesses. So we are going to have more emphasis on that rather than not-for-profits. We're going to talk about corporate governance, how the business runs itself. As I say, financial markets, how the business can fund itself, sources of funds for the business. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, so involving wider stakeholder groups. Last week, we mentioned stakeholder groups. We talked about the various types of stakeholders, you'll recall, and we reflect on that a little bit. Talk about recent improvements in corporate governance in the last decade or two. It's always ongoing because there's always issues emerging. And we're going to have a look at a case study to finish up the class this week, okay, called the Enron case study. So for the folks in the room, we're going to read a case study for a few minutes and then reflect on it and think about it and think, how does this fit into our studies? And then for the folks online, you're going to have to read it from the Moodle page, okay? So it's up there on the Moodle page called the Enron case study. So we're going to have a look at that at the end of the class and just talk about that and reflect on that a little bit. Morning all. So morning everybody who's just joined. Okay, so just to recap just a little bit on last week, the end of last week, we said that businesses, we're going to be looking at decision-making and tools for decision-making called investment appraisal in corporate finance. So just to think about, what's involved, because sometimes people, they think, I've got a choice between A and B, and I just make a decision. There's actually a number of steps beyond that, though, involved in this process. I mean, firstly, we need to know, what are we trying to do? What are we defining our objectives? What are we actually trying to do in decision-making? Is it to, let's say, expand our market share? Is it to launch a new product? Is it to make changes to an existing product? What is the business trying to do? What's our objective? We need to know that firstly. Some of these things you might think are common sense or sensible, but it's just useful to make sure that we're not missing a step along the way and realizing that this is actually quite a lengthy process around decision making. Then we need to kind of identify, okay, do some research, possible courses of action. What can we possibly do in order to meet that objective? So what is going to work best? Okay, what kind of possible choices do we have? We have a choice between one product A, and a product B, or a project to invest in capital expenditure in a new factory, okay, or a new a set of shops for a business. So we have a project around that. So we might have project X or project Y. Okay, so we have maybe some possible courses of action. We're not just limiting our options, basically, okay, to one choice. Then we need to sort of assemble more data, a lot more data relevant to that particular decision. And the key thing there is relevance. So we want to focus on really what is really important to this decision making. What matters really and what maybe doesn't matter so much, or is already decisions have been taken on. What's something that we call an irrelevant factor in the decision making process, or a sunk cost that's already been incurred or committed to. Then we want to assess the data and reach a decision, which is basically what we're doing in terms of when we look at investment appraisal in future weeks. We're going to be assessing the data that's given to us. It's something called cash flows, so the cash coming in and the cash that has to be spent going out of the business, and then reach the decision. So use the techniques, a couple of techniques that we look at in our investment appraisal study in corporate finance to reach the decision, implement the decision, and that can actually take a bit of time. So, you know, once the decision's been made, people got to get ready, got to be the resources on the ground ready to go ahead. Again, you might think this is very obvious, but you know, it's an important step because, you know, people might make a decision and then realize properly that they haven't properly researched things, or that, you know, some of the things we need to implement a decision are not available. And then finally, afterwards, very importantly, you have to follow up. Okay, we have to monitor a decision after we made the decision. What's the effect? Did things perform as we thought they were? When we're talking about these decisions, okay, through this process here, like you're looking into the future, you know, and the future is unknown, it's uncertain. Look how much uncertainty, you know, how much many unknown things we've seen this year, last year, you know, since the pandemic, and you know, Ukraine situation, then the gas and oil prices, and so on, you know, so there's a lot of change all the time happening. Okay, there's loads of change happening all the time, as we know. So it's going to be like that in the future to some extent. We'd hope things settle down for sure in the next few years. We hope things settle down, but there will be change, and so we have to then reflect, follow up on our decision and reflect. How did things work out? You know, how have things happened? So what we call a post-completion review. So after this decision has been implemented, did things actually work out as we said they were going to? And the people who are involved in this, there's really two splits, if you like, of the organizations. Well, we could argue three, really, in a way. Our main focus is going to be focusing on the main type of business that there is in the world, main type of corporate, which is the private business. Okay, so it's not run by the state, it's not run by a government, okay, or international governments. But there can also be what we call not-for-profits or not-for-profit organizations. The NFP, not-for-profit organizations, which are organizations primarily with government involvement. Okay, they're either owned fully by the government or majority owned by the government, that have a wider objectives beyond just maximizing the wealth of the owners, the shareholders. So we are familiar with dealing with these. You know, the Public Health Service is a big example. Okay, National Health Service, it's a big example. We have countries with a National Health Service. You know, they have an objective beyond just making a profit. Okay, clearly their objectives are caring for the society, the health of the wider society in all manner of ways. Okay, that doesn't mean that they ignore money, or they can ignore money in their decision making. That doesn't mean they can be wasteful with money, or they should be wasteful with money. They need to be measured under something that we call the 3 E's. Okay, value for money under the 3 E's. So these not-for-profit organizations still have to consider value for money. A public bus service, a public water service. We obviously need water, you know, we need electricity. Very often electricity companies are in the state control, although increasingly the private sector is becoming involved. And so there's a bit of criticism of that at the moment, because people are thinking electricity is absolutely really an essential service at this stage in our society and economy. So, you know, should we have businesses? The question that's out there, should we have businesses, private businesses that are mainly, you know, publicly, mainly driven by the shareholders, by wealth, increasing the wealth of the shareholders? When we have essential services, maybe we have, you know, a key, very absolutely critical non-financial primary objective. Provide a health service, provide a bus service, provide electricity. Okay, that doesn't mean that these organizations, these not-for-profits, just ignore money, waste money, spend money, have loads of money to just blow. They also have supporting financial objectives. They charge the public. They have a way of budgeting, of controlling their costs. They're not wasteful. They are controlling their resources and not spending money unnecessarily. Then how we measure these, how we consider this, is something called value for money. Okay, and these not-for-profit organizations. Again, value for money is probably a concept, an idea we know ourselves. A bit of common sense in some ways. You know, are we getting for what we're putting into the money, into the project, into the resource? Are we getting a good results? Are we meeting our objectives? Are we being efficient? Are we being effective? So those 3 E's, those 3 key E's, the 3 words are important for this value for money measuring concept. Economy, spending the money wisely, it's not wasting money, controlling the money. Just because the government is involved doesn't mean it's an excuse that lots of money can be just spent. We need to see it's spent wisely, okay, carefully. Efficiency, are we being efficient? Which is always a challenge in these not-for-profit organizations. It's always a challenge in a public service. There is a lot of criticism that maybe some public bodies in the past have not been very efficient. So there's always some scrutiny and pressure comes on from the public, from taxpayers, from businesses as well, to say, are you being efficient? Are you running things well? Okay, are you getting things done quickly? Are you getting things done effectively? And then finally, effectiveness or effective. Are we effective? The goals, are we achieving the goals? Are we achieving what we set out to do, the main objectives we set out to do? Because there's no point in us spending loads of money thinking we're very efficient, we're not actually meeting the goals, that we're going off and meeting other goals that are not, we're not tackling a really critical thing in our health service, we're not tackling a really critical thing in our public transport. We're spending money somewhere else, and we're spending it, we're doing it very efficiently, and we could be controlling the cost well, but are we actually meeting the objectives? Are we being effective in what we're trying to do? So these 3 E's under value for money are how these not-for-profit organizations are monitored. So just to recap on that, we talked about this at the end of last week. Effectiveness, are we being effective in meeting our objectives, considering what we set out to do? So in a college, the number of pupils that are taught by the college, a measure of our outputs coming out at the end of a period of time, a year or 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Then are we being efficient? How are we doing it? How are we going about it? Are we, for the resources we're putting in, are they effective and efficient? So, for example, for college, class sizes in the college or in a school, they're not too big, they're not too small, they're just at the right sort of level of efficiency. Because we don't want to have too small a group, we don't have too large a group. We want to get somewhere that works well and is efficiently run. It's not too big, not too small. And then economy, spending money frugally, okay, which the organization certainly be concerned about, that we're not wasting money, that we're careful, we're properly accounting for our money. So our accounting systems are proper, our processes are properly measuring and controlling the money that's available. And with these not-for-profit organizations that value for money, as I say, there's always a lot of scrutiny on this, because the journalists, the media, politicians, other people in industry, other businesses that are relying maybe on these public bodies, because there's a big economy. It's not just these public not-for-profit organizations or semi-state organizations. They sit away off in their own little corner and they don't have anything to do with anybody else. If they're not run well, they're not effective, efficient, and doing things economically, it'll have a knock-on effect on the private businesses as well. Bad infrastructure, bad health service, it's not very well run. Bad water company that's got a lot of inefficient ways of doing things. Bad electricity supply, bad broadband. These are some of the kind of critical infrastructure that's typically dealt with by the not-for-profit organizations. And when we talk about not-for-profit organizations, often we are involving government at some level. Okay, some level of government, a national government, an international body, like the EU, for example, an example, UN, that kind of supranational body, down to local authorities, local, regional governments, local governments. And as I say, the main goal will not be, they will not say things like, we're looking to maximize shareholder value, like some of the quotes we talked about last week. For private businesses, they're going to have wider goals. Doesn't mean that they're not concerned with value for money, because they certainly are. And doesn't mean that they can just forget about the economy of what they're doing, they're making sure they're spending wisely because they have to. But doesn't mean they won't have accounts, doesn't mean they won't have accounting systems, doesn't mean they won't have budgets. It's just that they're not really driven by those commercial, their main focus is not just that commercial objective, giving profit back to the shareholders, as we saw last week, is many companies like Tesco, the banks, that's what they actually say, that is their role, that's their main goal. So you think typically involving people like politicians and civil servants, which brings its own agendas sometimes in, okay? Sometimes wider stakeholders involved, and can be different dynamic going on in terms of politicians and civil servants dominating thinking. And how is this all funded? Well, when I said there's kind of two ways of looking at organizations, or the corporate, private, purely private, and then these not-for-profit, typically government, quasi-government, semi-state government bodies. There can actually be a third way of doing things, really, which is what we call private-public partnerships, PPPs and PFIs, private funding initiatives, where we basically got a mixture between the two. Okay, you've got private businesses and the public coming together. So very often, certainly in European Union, they have been involved in the UK as well. They've been involved in these PPPs, these public-private partnerships, quite a lot, to build bridges. I mean, literally building bridges, building roads, building infrastructure, building tram systems. So you've got a mixture between a private organization who says we have to deliver shareholder value, maximize shareholder wealth, and then you've got this public ethos, this public idea, this public not-for-profit set of objectives. We must run things properly for society. They must be affordable. We have to be effective. We get value for money for the services. So increasingly, we've seen this, you could say it's like a merging between the private sector and the public sector increasingly. And this mixed, there are advantages and disadvantages. Mixed results comes from that, sometimes, because yes, it's brought things more efficient, things that got done that mightn't have been done, building more roads, but then on the other hand, there's been, certainly money wasted as well, with the crossover between the two, and who's really in charge, who really is responsible and accountable for the project to make sure it doesn't overrun in its costs. Because sometimes this infrastructure is great to have, but we have seen situations, not least in Ireland, but I mean, in other European countries, other countries around the world, the money's been spent way more than it should be, okay, on building a new stadium, building new roads, building a new railway system, and so on. And who's responsible? And the private sector might say it wasn't us, and the public sector might say it's not us. We kind of go, well, who is, who's got the key responsibility here for this? Okay, so just then to recap, folks. Firstly, then, okay, it's gone 9:15. So I want to make sure we do our attendance. So for the folks who are on Zoom, that of course means that your attendance will be taken, as you know, by your Zoom login. So what we're going to do in the room here quickly is do the QR code, take a couple of minutes just. So we're going to go off from sharing the screen, and we're going to, okay, so we're back in the room, folks, here. We've done the attendance in the room. So one thing we're going to talk about today is something called corporate governance. Okay, corporate governance. We heard of that term before in our previous studies. Corporate governance. Corporate finance is the name of our module, which really means how does a business, how does an organization, okay, finance itself, and what does it do with the money, which is really what this module is about, corporate finance. Corporate governance, well, the corporate is the same. So we're talking about an organization. Governance, the government, if you like, of the organization. How does the organization run itself? Okay, so this definition from the textbook we follow, Fundamentals of Corporate Finance, the corporate finance book that we have copies of which are available in the library. Corporate governance is concerned with how firms manage themselves, the way this performance is monitored. So it's the way that they're run, and how do they monitor, how do they figure out and understand and inform themselves how they're doing. Okay, so how is their performance monitored? Are they doing well? Are they not doing so well? Okay, so it's it's all across the whole organization, the corporate, and from the highest levels down through the organization is concerned with corporate governance at various levels. More focus at the top levels, naturally, but doesn't mean that everybody in the organization doesn't have some role to play in corporate governance. This is an important development in business, okay? And so we're studying business and business studies. Corporate governance is a development in the business world in the last, especially in the last, well, it has actually been always there, but it's certainly been developed a lot more in the last 20, 30 years. And in particular, really in the last 10 to 15 years, okay? Reason being that we found around the world, not just in one particular country as such and one system, we found that in business and in not-for-profit organizations that are government involvement, we found that things weren't being run very well, okay? And which led to actually business failure, okay? Which meant lights out, shut up shop in some cases, okay? Business is literally going. So if we're studying business, we have to think, this is absolutely fundamental. We have to make sure the business can survive and that the business is reasonably well run and we're monitoring how the business is getting on. Now, you might think this is very common sense, okay? Very common sense stuff, and it is, but that doesn't mean that people haven't made a lot of mistakes, and we haven't seen big failures over the last number of years. So we've seen a number of business failures as a result of poor governance, how the business is run, how it's monitoring itself. It's not being run very well, and people are not monitoring how it's getting on. You might have heard of some of these, you may not have, but some of the examples, and they are coming from different places. BCCI is one of the original cases of people reacting, business environment reacting to poor corporate governance. It was a British bank. It wasn't that big a bank. Back about 1991, about 30 years ago, British bank, but people have money in the bank. People had loans from the bank. And this bank failed back in 1991, called BCCI. Didn't really, operated more internationally, Bank of Credit Commercial International. So it operated internationally out of London. Wasn't like a main high street bank that we would see on the street, but a commercial bank. Still had a lot of effects how badly run this bank was. So people get, to say the least, disadvantaged by this, okay? Because maybe money is lost, obviously. Money is lost, people's jobs are lost, business can't get finance when we have a failure of something like a bank. So that happened about 30 years ago. Then about 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, and you might think that's a long time ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. In business terms, it isn't really, because we're still dealing with the fallout from some of these failures from 20, 30, 40 years ago. We still see people trying to repeat the same patterns of bad behavior. Okay, we still see risks of business failure today. So these are all, they may happen in history of the last 20, 30 years, but they're still very, very, very relevant to what's going on, and people are still studying them and learning about what happened in these cases. About 20 years ago, we had companies called Enron, which we're going to have a look at the case study on that at the end of the class today, see what they were doing and why they were run so badly. And that was a big energy company in California. So this happens, it can happen globally. Doesn't just happen in UK or Ireland. It definitely has affected and been an issue in businesses in American states. Enron was a huge Californian energy company that was very badly run and ended up failing. And when it failed, what happens in that situation, the shareholders lost everything, okay? So one of the reasons why I said last week, corporate finance, we said the key objective of private organizations is to maximize shareholder wealth. One of the key reasons why that is because if things go badly wrong, the shareholders lose everything. If the business fails, shareholders lose everything, okay? So that's very serious. That's actual real people losing money in cases. So, maybe not always very wealthy people, so we can't have businesses going around failing, not on that scale. Okay, yes, businesses fail naturally in the marketplace, but when a big energy company fails like that, it has a lot of effects on the economy and society. Nortel was a big Canadian telecommunications company that had a lot of issues around corporate governance. That happened in Canada. Bear Stearns was a big bank in Wall Street in America. So you're aware of Wall Street. You might have heard of Wall Street in New York. It's the biggest financial center in the world. Bear Stearns was a big bank that failed in 2008. There was also in 2008 another big bank failure called Lehman Brothers in 2008. So we still talk about 2008. It's amazing it's 14 years ago, nearly 15 years ago. But to be honest, we are still dealing with the fallout from 2008. It just because it happened 14, 15 years ago, doesn't actually mean it's not current and relevant to what's going on today, because we're still dealing with the fallout of what happened in 2008 financial crisis, global financial crisis, which was global, okay, which, you know, it did affect various regions around the world. Now, Ireland was very badly affected by the 2008 financial crisis. We had a company here called Anglo-Irish Bank, which is very famous, infamous, because it was very badly run, bad corporate governance. But you know, Britain was affected by it, Italy, very badly affected, Iceland, America, you know, not so much Asian countries, or India at that time, but certainly European and American countries in particular had a lot of bad impacts on the society and on the economy. And it was front page news. It was the big news in the headlines at the time. So think about, you know, everything we're dealing with in the last couple of years. What people at that time were talking really about was this global financial crisis. And because it hasn't really been completely solved, really, in many people's opinion, you know, we're still kind of dealing with fallout from it and results of it. There was a lot of debt taken on by countries. There was a lot of, people say money printing, but there was a lot of central bank involvement in trying to fix it, and that's still continuing to this day. So it's absolutely still, 2008 financial crisis, still very hot topic in the world of business and the economy. So when we have these huge failures, like shareholders start losing money, people are losing their jobs, people's pensions starting to get hit, people have difficulty paying their mortgages. There's a bigger knock-on effect on society. So it's big impact for stakeholders and society, not just the shareholders. So we study this in order to get some continuous improvement and also to learn from the mistakes of the past, not just to ignore them. Because the worst thing would be to just keep doing the same thing over and over again, leading to these terrible failures and not actually learn some lessons and not improve some of the behavior and how businesses are run. So just to recap, so folks, last week I asked you at the end of the week just to think about stakeholder groups in a public company. And now we just talked about corporate governance and mentioned something like the global financial crisis, companies not being run very well. So I'm going to ask for the folks online, so we're here in the room, chat out on Zoom, and also to type into the chat as well, any thoughts that you have. So just reflect stakeholder groups in a public company. So public company being a company that issues its shares to the public, wide number of shareholders have a share in that business. There's a large number of owners of the business. People like the Ford Motor Company, for example, Tesco, the supermarket, Barclays Bank. What are the stakeholder groups in the public company, and what do you think, what do you think they're concerned with?
Users.
Users?
Yeah, like the customers.
Customers?
Yeah, the government. Because
yeah, the government is a stakeholder.
The workforce.
Yeah, the workforce working in the business, yeah, and on the organization, yeah. So what are they concerned with? What kind of things are they? Even now, let's say today, what are some of these people concerned with? Let's bring it right up to date.
Kind of like profit.
Okay, so profit, who's concerned with the profits?
Those who like stakeholders or shareholders, because if there's no profit, they will be not gaining anything from their income, right?
Right. Okay, so the shareholders are mainly concerned, yeah, with the profits. The management as well, so they're stakeholders, so they would be concerned with the they would be tasked with running the business effectively, okay, and making sure it has some profits. Thanks, okay. Any other groups, what would they be concerned about?
I mean, the competition of each company, the competitor.
Competitors?
Yeah.
Well, they're competitors, so why do they kind of care really how well things are going in the company in a way? If, you know, competitor might think if the company's not well run or is doing badly, it's one less competitor for them, you know. So they probably wouldn't be one of the main stakeholder groups really to be concerned with, because they're outside of the organization really. Anybody else have any other well, who, you know, any other stakeholder group have any other concerns about the company?
Would the government be concerned about taxes?
Government to be concerned about taxes, yeah. Government is heavily reliant on companies making money, which sometimes again surprises people. They might think, you know, we're not that worried about that, but government is actually taking a lot of taxes from companies.
Suppliers.
Suppliers, yeah. What are they concerned with?
The payment.
To get paid properly and on time, yeah.
And then debt holder.
Debt holders, the banks and people who lend money to the corporation. So debt holders are different from shareholders.
The employee, because if there's no profit, probably there would be a redundant.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, exactly. The employees are a stakeholder. Again, people mightn't think. Stakeholder is wider than shareholder. That's the whole idea. Okay, so absolutely, there are other people who have a stake, have an interest in the organization. So the employees will be concerned if the business is profitable because, yeah, as you correctly say, their job is more secure, they would hope. You know, less risk of them losing their job or being made redundant. Anything else? Anything else that people are happening in the world right now that might be concerned as a stakeholder concern in an organization, in a corporate? Water? War? Okay, yeah. Who is the stakeholder, or why are they concerned?
May change the raw materials, I don't know.
Yeah. The effect of the war could change. Yeah. The effect of the war, you know, could concern the suppliers or the customers. The prices are going up.
Sorry, Declan. It may not directly impact them, but in some way they are impacted with the war and the weather crisis, like global warming and everything. Somehow rather they are slightly impacted, not directly.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the general environment. We say environment in business, you know, we mean the economy but then the war and then the actual environment, you know, the climate and the weather, and you know, we've too much water in one place and then we've droughts in other places and so on. It can affect the results of the organization, and then that will affect some of the stakeholder groups, like the customers, you know, might not be able to get the goods from the organization.
And also, like because of the Ukraine and Russia war, and we have the oil crisis, that could impact the motor company, car companies in selling them, probably, because some people now want to go for non-electric. I mean electric cars, not a diesel car.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. So the car companies, absolutely, the car company is very current, because car companies are having a hard time. Definitely, it's actually can be actually difficult to buy a car. You know, there's a big waiting list. Certainly in Ireland, there's a waiting list to buy cars. You know, new cars. And the car sales are down quite a lot. So they're badly affected by Ukraine because a lot of them had factories that are impacted. And then you've got the oil price increases as well. And then you've got the move to electric and so on. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe another one is the communities where the companies are set.
The local community.
Yeah.
So, you know, are there issues around how the corporate is behaving in the community and the environment, and the company might want to, you know, increase their working hours, but then the community might say, well, that's going to make a lot of noise and increase traffic in the area and that kind of thing. So communities are also stakeholders.
There was a gold mining near where I live in Chile, and the community made such a campaign for them to close because of environment reasons.
Right.
It was millions of dollars, like billions of dollars
Yeah.
that they invest, and they had to close. That's
Yeah.
it. And they were all set, like all set up, like the company was there, they just couldn't open. So imagine all that loss.
Yeah, so mining companies are very careful about their image and corporate social responsibility and their economic, their environmental, social and governance, because they're seen to be difficult in terms of the environment and the local communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
That's yeah, the importance of the community as a stakeholder, like they couldn't open.
the community shut down the operation. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And then the environmental groups as well. We could say part of the community, but you know, the environmental groups are a big player as well in shutting down maybe the operations of a factory or a mine or how the business is running. So you can, you know about some of these cases yourself. It's just you mightn't have thought about them this way, but this is what we're thinking about in terms of corporate social responsibility, stakeholders, and corporate governance. And businesses spend a lot of time now, in the last number of years, businesses spend a lot of time telling us, you know, which we're aware of, and we see it all the time. They're telling us a lot about, you know, what they're doing, that they're behaving themselves. And that's some of the reason why businesses are spending so much time and money telling us that they're behaving themselves in terms of the environment, social and governance. Is because of they've done bad things in the past. You know, so there was too much pollution. They just weren't behaving very well in terms of the employees or the local community. They weren't maybe paying taxes they probably should have been, you know, so they weren't maybe behaving themselves in the past. And that's why now you see so much, all of a sudden companies can't wait to tell us on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media, on television, how they're improving their behavior. Just another one there on that stakeholder groups is, you know, employees are, if you have things like strikes, employees looking for pay rises, you know, if employees are looking for pay rises, you know, these are, the employees are a stakeholder group as well, you know, and they may be saying to the organization, you need to give me a pay rise, or I'm looking for a pay rise, or I'm looking for better conditions in some way, and have a strike. So it's actually going on a lot all the time, but it's actually, again, the employees kind of looking for better conditions is definitely something that we've seen in the last year. Maybe not so much during 2020 and 2021 when the pandemic and the lockdowns were going on. Now people come out of the lockdowns, there's a lot more industrial unrest or risks of strikes and so on. So it's very topical all the time. It's always out there. There's always examples. You'll come across examples yourself in your own life. I mean, literally, this touches all parts of society. So we're thinking about corporates. We split up private businesses into really three different types of corporate entities. Okay, you'd be familiar with some of these. So just to recap, the very simplest form of business will be a sole trader. Okay, so when we look at a very basic business in the first couple of semesters of business studies degree, we think about concentrating on keeping it reasonably simple. Concentrating on a sole trader, one person in business on their own. They are fully responsible for what happens in the business, for the debts of the business. There's a limited life to that business because it's linked to the life of the owner. If the owner retires, the business could stop, basically, because dependent on that one owner. The owner gets the profits. Okay, one person in business on their own is sole trader. We could also have partnerships. We've got two or more people. We can't have a partnership with just one person. We can't really have a partnership very easily or effectively with 100, 300 people in it. Not usually. Okay, so usually up to maybe about 20 people or so in a partnership. Basically, a number, if you like, of sole traders come together to work together and have shared ownership in their organization. Okay, so think about partnership of doctors working together, 2 or 3 doctors. If you go into your doctor, you know, you may see this, you know, is it just one person? It can just be one person, but often there's a couple of other doctors working in the partnership. So that's an example, an everyday example of a partnership. So these partners have unlimited liabilities for the debts of the partnership, but they get the share of profits in what the business is making, and they get to share decisions. So it's not quite as lonely, or it's not just one person.
And it's equally, it's not like 20%.
It's not always equally. It depends on the agreement of the partners.
Right.
So it, you know, it could be equally, but it could also be 60-40. You know, it could be 70-30. One partner is put a lot more in to build up the business, for example. Okay, so partnerships can be a limited company with some crossover to company and corporate law, but typically they are sole traders. Okay, not getting too much into the complexity of the legals on that, but the legal situation on that. Generally speaking, the partnership is a limited life of the partners. Okay. The whole idea here is a few more people involved than just the sole trader on their own. Primarily, we're going to be involved in thinking about medium to larger size organizations. When we look at corporate finance, our main focus is going to be on medium to larger businesses, tend to be incorporated or companies. So incorporation is a legal idea, a legal concept. Under company law, they've got their own unique laws, their own taxes, corporation tax that they have to pay. And usually what happens is the business gets to a certain scale that it's just too much for one owner or even a partnership. And they need, or they're expected to have, a company. Key aspect of a company is that, unlike with the sole trader and the partnership, where the owner has full unlimited responsibility for the debts, one of the key advantages of setting up the company is that the debts are limited. Okay, we have a limit. There is a limit. The owners have a limit on how much they can be responsible for any debt that the business may take on from a bank. Okay, so there's a limited amount of money that the owners can lose. There's a big advantage of the company. Companies are typically called either public, where their shares are traded publicly, or private. And if the private, historically, we've always called them limited LTDs. You see LTD, that means a private company. You see PLC, that's sort of short for public, because you see the P, L, and C in the public name there. So under company law, they have, it is a separate legal person. The actual company is separate from the owners. So it can be sued or can sue or be sued, has the rights and duties, obligations, enter, exit contracts on its own. It has a lot of strict rules. You will be familiar with some of this from your legal law studies in the past. Things like the articles of incorporation, memorandum of association, rules around how the business is run. Okay, and even still, we find companies not being run very well. Company law. So in Ireland, Companies Act 1963 to 2017 has its own form of law, its own form of tax. ownership can usually be sold with the shares. So we're talking shares and shareholders. We're talking about companies. Okay, we're not talking sole traders. We're not talking partnerships. How the shareholders get an income is what we call a dividend. Okay, which you would have seen in the past somewhere in your accounting study. They don't get interest. They don't get the thing that they get is not called profit. The way that the shareholders get their money out of, it's not drawings like with the sole trader. The way that the shareholders get the money out of the organization is called a dividend. We saw this last week. We talked about total shareholder return. We said that they're hoping, the shareholders are hoping to get a shareholder return by getting a dividend.
Declan, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
This dividend they only get if they made a profit.
Typically, yeah, they would be
Okay.
expected. Yeah.
All right.
Typically, it would be up to the business, that the shareholders and people like the auditors, to make sure that they are taking the right approach in paying a dividend. But usually we expect we'll only be paying out dividends usually when the business has made some profit, because otherwise we're we're weakening the finance of the organization, we're weakening the finances of the business, and we're taking out dividends when there is little profit or no profit. Okay. Right, so let's take a break for 15 minutes, folks. And we'll come back. We're going to have a look at corporate governance in a bit more detail. So be back in 15 minutes. Thanks. Back after break. So we'll come back after a break there. So we are continuing to look at something called corporate governance. We've talked about the start of the class before the break. We said that corporate governance is a hot topic in business. And that's continuing. It's an ongoing process. It's basically concerned with how business runs itself. So it's going to have a big impact throughout an organization. Our main focus in corporate finance, corporate governance is an important part of the introduction phase, first couple of classes of corporate finance. So we're concerned, we have 12 weeks in corporate finance, we have to focus ourselves in on certain areas. We're concerned mainly on what financial managers are concerned with, financial management of the organization. And corporate governance will be very much a big part of their work, their role, okay, in the finance area. So finance managers, financial management of an organization, be very concerned with corporate governance on an ongoing basis, be part of their day-to-day jobs. They have a lot of regulations coming in all the time, depending on what sector. Regulations are laws, okay? Laws coming from governments and from international bodies like the European Union, from the United Nations. A lot of kind of laws and regulations are coming down through their governments to tell them how to behave, how to do certain things, how to report certain things. So they have a lot of, limits on maybe what they can do in their organization, limits on what they can, how they can operate their business. Okay. So it will be something that finance managers have had to deal with and get used to and work around and adopt over the last number of years. And it's a regulator, they're more concentrated in certain industries like banking, insurance, education have regulators, oil companies, gas companies, water companies, where there's a particular public service primarily, okay, but something in the economy is very important to the economy. There's more regulation than maybe other areas that are more established and considered less risky, okay, maybe like retail, okay, running retail chains, maybe, for example, okay, running a chain of shops may not have quite as level of regulation as running an oil company or a mining company, for example, okay. With all these additional regulations, where would they have come down from typically international bodies, the international cooperation across the United Nations or the European Union for European countries, the OECD, the World Bank, these big international organizations, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they typically are have a cross-border, okay, a cross-border global kind of view of how things are happening, how things are developing, how businesses are running themselves, how is corporate governance running around the world, and what lessons could be learned. So there could be a company somewhere in Canada that isn't doing something particularly well, it failed. And instead of just saying, oh, only Canadian companies need to consider this, with these international organizations like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Coordination and Development, the IMF, the EU, the UN in particular, okay, they would feed down to national governments, okay, and European-wide organizations like the EU, okay, to monitor how companies are behaving and how companies are being run, and how companies are working. As we said before the break, corporate governance is so important. Why? We said it was very important coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. Why then did we have these kind of business failures that we had, like big banks? It's mentioned before the break, Anglo-Irish Bank in Ireland, in Dublin, was a very famous case in Ireland of poor corporate governance. Bear Stearns in the US, Lehman Brothers in the US, Northern Rock was an example of a bank in a building society, former building society in Britain, in the UK, that failed. And at the time, you know, at that time, there was actually queues of people queuing outside the banks in the UK, when Northern Rock kind of hit their problems in the UK, queues of people queuing outside the banks, and the news cameras were following this story and showing people queuing. So that's very, very damaging for the economy to have a lack of confidence like that. So there had to be a lot of changes made to stop that from happening, okay, and to learn the lessons from it. With globalization, really, over the last 20 years, okay, where organizations are globalized, so they're more or less sort of local in their outlook, maybe, and more or less national in their outlook, and they're more global. Businesses have become a lot more complex and interconnected. And one of the issues we've seen, and we continue to see to some extent, maybe, is something it's called groupthink. Groupthink is where everyone all just thinks exactly the same thing, and maybe just follow a leader somehow, or a group of leaders, and we just think everything that those people think, whether it's good or a bad idea, and that can be a problem, basically. Okay, we may have what we call a lack of diversity of opinion. Diversity of opinion is saying things should be challenged, ideas should be challenged, that we should be thinking, is this the right course of action? Just because my boss thinks it's the right way to do something, my boss's boss's boss, the chief executive, the top people at the very big jobs in the organization, just because they think a certain route is the way to go, naturally employees fall into line and they start to think, you know, well, I better get into line with what the direction is, and maybe not challenge it enough, you know, and maybe we don't have enough ability in business and in day-to-day working of the organization to sort of challenge decisions. Now, you know, to a certain degree, things should be challenged, you know, for good governance, for this to work well, and for us to have some kind of debate and challenge of opinion, it needs to be done on a certain level. I mean, it's not just arguing with people or disagreeing with people for the sake of it, okay? So the typical challenge, you know, we talk about, you know, well, let's challenge the direction of something, or let's challenge the decision. One of the first questions we need to think about or ask is, what's our alternative? You know, what's a better way? Why do we have an issue with this? You know, why do we want to challenge this thinking? Why do we want to challenge a certain decision? Do we have a better alternative? Considering we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited money, you know, there are limitations on life, on resources. So we can't live just in a dreamland of, you know, unlimited sums of money. There are limitations on how much money the business could spend. So there's a balance there, okay? Basically, there's a balancing act. But certainly lack of diversity of opinion, so people challenging things in a smart way, okay, in an advanced way, not just saying no to things and disagreeing and, you know, just being awkward about things, or just, you know, not presenting a better alternative. We certainly should have ability to have some challenge of how key decisions are made, basically, because otherwise we can have everyone just following groupthink and following a certain direction, and that may lead us down a bad road, maybe. Okay, it might. So we will sort of see that a bit with the Enron situation. We talk about Enron later, where we didn't have enough groupthink, we didn't have enough diversity of opinion. Dissenting voices are people who say, no, I'm not maybe happy with that, or I'm not necessarily disagree with everything there. Okay, and this is why. Okay, and this is why I maybe do things a bit different. So it's not just disagreeing or arguing or being awkward. Okay, for the sake of it, it's also what alternative. What am I offering here? Why do I think my idea is better? That's the key thing. That's the difficult thing to follow that up, because everyone can disagree and say no to things, but presenting a better idea or a better case is where the challenge comes. Okay, so for a few minutes, folks, just for a couple of minutes, take a few 3 or 4 minutes for the folks who are online and folks here in the room. Just want you to consider and report back. So just think about this, reflect on this, and then let's have a little bit of discussion, please, for the folks who are online by the chat or on the audio, and then for the folks in the room. So let's just consider how corporate governance might impact on the day-to-day activities of, firstly, a new employee, and secondly, their supervisor or manager. So just think about this for a moment or two, and then shout out your answers. Okay, I'm going to ask the folks online firstly. Okay, just we'll talk about it in the room. So just the folks who are online, either through the chat or come on to the audio. How would corporate governance, you think, how would this impact on a new employee, their first couple of weeks in the job? Just for the folks who are online first, and then we'll talk about it in the room.
Declan, sorry, would you please elaborate the question, please?
So this thing, corporate governance, that we've been talking about, how might this impact on the day-to-day activities of a new employee, firstly? Imagine a new employee, the first couple of weeks they have in their job. How does this corporate governance impact on them?
Can I say pressure?
Pressure?
Yeah.
Okay. In what way?
Because they are a new employee, so they will kind of feel pressured by the corporate governance whether they are doing the right thing or not.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. No, I mean, they could be feel under some pressure. Are they doing the right thing? They're going to be maybe monitored on that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think for a corporate thing, everything has to be written down and everything has to be tallied at the end of the day.
So, writing down procedures, we have procedures for doing things.
Yes, so that could, put pressure on them.
A lot of reading and a lot of new things in the job. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Franklin's interfering on rules and regulations. So they certainly have rules and regulations, that they have to concern themselves with, depending on, depends on what the job is, I suppose, basically how senior the job is. But, very often there are some rules, obviously rules and regulations internally in the organization, but also coming in from the government or from law or from a regulator. Thanks on the chat, Alessandre. So it depends on the situation. Can be pressure to do the right thing if they had chosen the right person. So absolutely, it will depend on the level of the job. But even down to a fairly junior role, there will be regulations and rules and training and procedures and way to behave as well, and way to conduct themselves that would flow down from the higher parts of the organization through down to the lower levels of the organization. Okay, so a lot of learning on the job, a lot of new rules and regulations, some pressure on to say, This is the way we have to run things, this is the way we have to behave. This is what we're expected to do as part of a job. Thanks. The folks who contributed there online on Zoom. Any other points? Anybody else in the room? Any other different parts of a new employee corporate governance impacting on their day-to-day? What about the supervisor or manager for anybody online or on Zoom or in the room? Well, how would their corporate governance maybe impact the day-to-day activities of the new employee's supervisor or manager?
For example, let's say if the new employee has to present something to the supervisor and the supervisor has to carry that to the higher management. If the data they are providing is incorrect, that could impact the supervisor management theory, right?
Okay, so there's some monitoring. The supervisor or manager will be monitoring what the employees are doing, and they have to then report that, monitor it, show that it's being monitored, and then report it up to their
To the hierarchy.
Yeah. So when we say we describe corporate governance here, we defined it here. Well, the book Fundamentals of Corporate Finance defined concerned with how firms manage themselves, the way this performance is monitored. So unless we're monitoring things, we don't know how this performance is going. So it has to be some way of reporting this or monitoring it, which is obviously very important part of the supervisor or the management's job. And you could say, well, let's, sometimes people think, oh, it's some boss somewhere up at the top, and it's their job and that's it. But sure, how are they to know what everyone is doing? Like, where do they get the information from? Like, did they go around checking everyone's job every day? So, they're relying on managers below and, throughout the organization, they're relying on understanding how everything is working. So you can't have a situation where you just got people at the top in the big job positions and they don't know what's actually happening on the ground. Well, you can have that situation, but it's not good corporate governance. It can go on, but it's not really monitoring how things are working.
I think most of the places they go through the QA process, like kind of QA process, so they know how is the procedures and the quality process that they have to follow. So it's not like the top will check that there is another department checking.
Yeah.
And just passing by the reports to the top.
So you mentioned QA or quality assurance and quality measurement, yeah. And checking procedures, that people have procedures. So absolutely, yeah. That would be part of the corporate governance, how the business is running itself, and then how it's monitoring. So when you have checks, any kind of checks that are going on, or quality assurance, QA, quality checks, quality control. Any other point? I mean, that covers a lot of points there, actually. Well, any other points?
It's like we make sure the goals that are set out from the top management are being achieved, no?
That's monitoring, yeah, monitoring that the goals that have been set out, the direction has been set, are being achieved or not being achieved. So this is why we have these checks and people checking on us and, quality assurance, quality control checks and so on, to make sure that we're doing the right thing, we're following procedures, the procedures are working. Sometimes the procedures and the processes have to change.
Declan, sorry, this could impact, let's say, certain department didn't perform well. That could impact that particular department or the overall company.
So if a certain department didn't perform particularly well, is that?
Yeah, it somehow rather that could impact the company or
Yeah,
slightly.
Yeah, I mean, it could be department wide. And depending on what the role of the department is, it could be very serious. So, you can have, especially when it comes to laws and dealing with the government and regulations and so on, you know, businesses get fined a lot of money as well by governments sometimes, you know, and the governments are getting very, we think we're seeing a lot more fining of companies than we used to, as part of this extra corporate governance. And, you know, that's another way for the government to pull in revenue and be a stakeholder. It's not just to tax a business, but to fine it. You know, so you've seen a lot of tech companies get fined. Instagram was fined, like Instagram is also Facebook. Facebook was fined in the past. You know, Google, Apple, these kind of tech companies have been fined a lot of money by governments recently. Good, okay. Okay, it's just good to just consider that. It's actually part of day-to-day work in an organization. Yeah, in the class last week, you mentioned agency issues and agency risk and agency costs. As businesses have got more and more sophisticated, as we moved through the economic history, we moved away from basic businesses and farms and so on into industrial businesses, and then this globalization. Things have gotten a lot more complicated. And the ownership structure and the ownership, who is controlling the organization, becomes more complicated. Who is really making the decisions? We could ask the question, you know, in an organization. Is it always in the best interest of the owners? Or is it laissez-faire, meaning is it just whatever happens, happens, basically, okay? It's just left to just naturally happen. Decisions are naturally left to happen in some way. Who controls the business? Who makes the decisions? We have what we call an agency relationship between the shareholders. The shareholders basically hand over their business. It is their business, they're the owners. So if you think like they are shareholders in a private organization or owners, but they own the building, they own the computers and so on, right? But they may never actually visit that building. They may never, of course, use the premises of the organization, even though they're the owners. They hand over, if you like, the management, day-to-day management to the management, the senior management, and then further down. So they are what we say agents. The management are agents. Okay, we have an agency relationship. And when it comes to this agency relationship and the question of who is dominating, there's really considered two types of issues have occurred in businesses, in particular in the last number of years, the last couple of decades. We can have an issue around what we call a type 1 agency, where we have conflict of interest. The most typical type of issue we may have is a conflict of interest between the shareholders and the management, where the management are going off and doing their own thing. Okay, we don't have this goal congruence, so we're looking to try and get where everyone's moving in the one direction towards the objectives of the organization. The management, for their own selfish reasons, maybe are going off and doing their own thing. They're paying themselves lots and lots of money that maybe they shouldn't be, based on the performance of the long-term performance of the organization. They're giving themselves big bonuses, they're rewarding themselves with all kinds of perks and cars and boats and yachts and all sorts. You know, or they're being corrupt in some way. The management are being corrupt in some way that is not in the interest of the shareholders. Now, that's probably the most common issue that we see in corporate governance. Okay, certainly one of the most common issues. There may also be what we call a type 2 agency and a type 2 agency conflict or agency risk, where we actually have conflict between the shareholders. So we've got one particular group of shareholders, or one shareholder is dominating another group. Okay, now this can be a very big issue in large organizations, any size organization, but usually in big organizations where we have millions of shareholders. So the big names that we know about, Coca-Cola and Apple and Facebook, Meta, whatever their latest name is, you know, they will have lots and lots of owners or shareholders all around the world. And of course, those shareholders they're not even in the same country as the company in many cases. And they certainly don't visit the premises. So small shareholders sometimes can be a little bit isolated under this kind of type 2 agency risk. And a large dominant shareholder, or a few large shareholders, might dominate things. Okay, we may have large dominant shareholders dominating the process and dictating decision making compared to some of the smaller shareholders. That can also be a big problem. So the type 1 type of agency problem or agency cost, we have a problem of goal alignment. We're thinking about managers versus shareholders. The management might be very strong egos. as well. It could be doing things like empire building, which is basically building up their own personal little empire, driven by their own ego for a short period of time, but that's not maybe in the interests of the organization. And we have seen that as in the cases of corporate governance of the past. They do tend to be dominated by very strong egos at the top. It's been a common theme across some of the big business failures we have seen in the last number of years. The second type of agency problem, that basically all of the individual shareholders have their own personal objectives, and they may not always be aligned and have goal congruence. And maybe some groups of shareholders may form to look after their own interests, maybe do their own deals on the side. There could be elements of corruption coming into the process where certain shareholders take on more dominance than the smaller shareholders. Okay, so all of the shareholders are meant to have some involvement in the corporate governance process, even if they're only small, through things like the annual general meeting of the organization. And so we shouldn't just have only big dominant players coming in and dominating things. Again, we have a lack of diversity of opinion, so diversity of thought, if we have just one or two dominant blocks or dominant players amongst the shareholders. So we talked about stakeholders, we talked about shareholders. We talked earlier, about an hour ago, about the various stakeholders we saw last week. We said they would have different interests, okay? And it's an ongoing topic. Employees, community, government, regulators, environmental groups, these are wider stakeholders than just shareholders. So we understand the stakeholder approach, that basically organizations do have a variety of interests, of people interested in their decisions, not just the shareholders. We mentioned some of those groups. And these different groups can have different objectives, and they may not always be aligned all the time. So the employees, they are obviously concerned with their own life and their own working conditions, you know, but they may put constraints or limits on the organization that might limit their ability to operate or to make decisions. The employees, for their own welfare, they may have put a maximum number of hours they're going to work. That's a constraint on the corporate. The community, you mentioned earlier about the community having concerns. So you mentioned the case of a mining company that closed down actually made completely put constraints on the organization by stopping them from operating, basically. And it cost lots and lots of money to the company from the company's point of view. So community organizations, environmental organizations can and do put limits on the activities of organizations. And we're seeing this increasingly. We see this also with people like Extinction Rebellion, which is something that's in the news. They go around blocking roads and stuff a lot and protesting at shops and oil companies and the mining industry, mining companies, you know, would have a lot of constraints put on them from environmental groups and community groups. Some of the other people, the other stakeholders, customers, they want to get a good service, good product. So they may put limits on the organization. Minimum quality standards are expected, or maximum price that the customer will pay. That's a limitation or constraint. So it's not unlimited. Something that basically puts a limit on the organization's operations or the amount that they could charge. Suppliers, they want to make sure they've got a good trading relationship. They're going to be paid well and paid on time, considering a lot of suppliers are trading on credit, which means they're not paid until after the goods have been delivered. So they will put limits on the terms of payment and terms of business that they'll accept. They want to get paid within 30, 40, 50 days. They don't want the corporate to be taking too much advantage of their credit. Government, we said, is a huge stakeholder, and it's also out there to look after, or should be out looking after the consumer and protecting the consumer by putting in minimum laws and standards. Now, we could ask the question sometimes, is the government always protecting the consumer? And this is actually something we're seeing at the moment with the energy costs and so on. There's a lot of challenge, not just in local government or national government, but people like the EU as well are under a lot of pressure at the moment as far as, you know, the increase in electricity costs and gas bills and so on. And you know, one of the things that's being talked about is, are they actually properly protecting the consumer? You know, so how do we get to a situation where we're too reliant maybe on a certain type of fuel? Is the government and the regulators not meant to have been doing a better job there, maybe? And then it depends on the organization, depends on the industry, but you know, we may have things like trade bodies in a business, in an industry, who will be trying to make sure things run fairly smoothly and a good reputation for the industry, and it's running efficiently overall. So they may impose limits on the corporate minimum standards that have to be met across the industry. So in some ways, that's the way competitors may actually raise the standards across an overall industry. So these can all compete with each other as well, okay? We kind of talked about that a little bit last week. We said we can have, you know, a situation where the employees are competing maybe with the management or with the shareholders saying, we need to get paid more, or we need better conditions, and the management disagree with that. The management might disagree with the government about a tax treatment or a tax rate, or a law or a standard that has to be applied. So it has been taught that maximizing share price is too narrow an objective. However, the reality is that it is still a very important goal and objective in an organization. And they will say, and they do say, that they have to maximize shareholder value, maximizing share prices and returns to the shareholders through dividends. And one of the big arguments there is that we can have situations where employees are shareholders. Okay, there are wider people involved in being shareholders. There's wider society. These shareholders are often just regular savers, regular people who have put money into the organization, and they need to know that their money is being well managed and that they have good corporate governance in the organization. And that by, you know, looking after other stakeholders like customers, it's in the interest of the shareholders, in the interest of the organization, to have happy customers and to have good relations with the environment and the community. It's good for the image of the organization as well. And that will lead to maximization of profits. So the whole idea really is that this maximizing share price, maximizing shareholder value, it doesn't imply or shouldn't mean that the company is an outlaw or social outlaw or is behaving badly as such. Because there are crossovers to other stakeholder groups like employees. It's a bit timely, actually. This is an example of, and you will see this with lots of companies. You'll see this sort of stuff on Twitter and Facebook all the time, and social media companies are always telling us on their websites, they're always telling us what they're doing, how they're doing things. They're very keen to tell us. This is an example, Scottish and Southern Energy, a company in the UK, and they actually put up these core values. So you'll see here companies talking about values and core values. And you can see it there, some of the kind of core values they have: safety, accidents are preventable, we do everything safely and responsibly; service, give our customers great service, they're proud of; efficiency, you see the efficiency makes its way in here; keep things simple, do the work that adds value and avoid waste. Sustainability is a big key buzzword these days, in the last couple of years in particular, sustainable. We operate ethically, which means we behave ourselves and behave well, taking the society into account, taking a long-term view to achieve growth and safeguard the environment. There's a lot of attention on this in businesses these days. A lot of this is coming down from the UN, the United Nations, through local governments, in what they call sustainable growth. They want to be excellent, work smart and work better and be innovative and have teamwork. Now, this is what the companies say, but it's a good example, actually, a timely example here. I mean, we could pick any company. This is one particular energy company in Britain. This is what they say are their core values. It's timely because these companies, the moment, in the last couple of months, are very much in the news because of the increase in the energy prices and oil prices and the cost of electricity and gas going up so much. And it's kind of seen, does anybody know or aware of the news story around this? What's going on? Anybody hear anything at all about the news story about the energy companies? You're aware though that the oil prices and so on have gone up and so on, and people are saying a lot of it is to do with the war and so on. Now, some of the prices are coming back down again a bit, because petrol is not what it was, thankfully, a few months ago. But it's talked about a lot because it's actually a linkage here between some of the stakeholders. The governments are having to get involved a lot with the energy companies. It's actually a current live, very big business story across the European countries in particular, and Britain, UK included, with the winter coming along as well. The energy companies are making a lot of money, big profits, which you might think, well, that's great for the shareholders, which it is. But people are then saying, and governments are saying, well, you're making too much profit, and you're making profit because you're charging all of us, all the consumers, small businesses, large businesses, and individual people heating their homes and so on. We're paying for it by these huge bills that are increasing. And so the governments are stepping in. There's a lot of pressure now. It's a really big topic in politics, and in economics and in the economy, to do something what they call a windfall tax, which means basically putting more tax on these companies, these energy companies, as a way of getting some of that profit back. And then the government then starts handing out, the theory is anyway, the government starts handing out some credit to electricity users and heating, reducing heating bills. So it's a way of saying you're making too much money, you've got too much shareholder profit. We're going to pass some laws or put a tax in, or as I said, fine. Sometimes they fine. There's a way of getting that money and putting it back into the local economy, if you like, and smaller individual people who are struggling to heat their homes or to fill their cars with petrol or diesel, and then smaller medium businesses. So again, that's an example of these stakeholders. It's a live, real world that's happening all the time in the news at the moment. What is actually going to happen hasn't been finalized, but there's a lot of pressure on in Germany, Britain, and then it flows down through into Ireland eventually. That we have a conflict between the stakeholders, and the question would be, are the businesses really running themselves in the best way for society? Okay, so one thing we're going to be concerned with, one term we're going to use in future weeks in corporate finance is cash flow. Cash flow is basically how does the money, cash, flow around an organization. So it is something we're going to talk about. We refer to cash flow, we refer to how money flows around the business, in and out of the business. So this is a term we're going to see in future weeks. It's going to be an important idea. How does cash flow in? How does cash flow out? Also, we're concerned with how does the business get its finance? Where do we get the money from? So mainly, what's our sources of finance? Our main sources of finance for a business will be from the shareholders, things like stock markets, from the shareholders trading in their shares, from making money, from having what we call retained profits. So from money being made in the business, but also from debt holders from the banks. Okay. Typically what happens is when a person receives their salary in their bank account, they pay insurance or they pay into a pension. Very often this money is put into the financial markets and it's made available for businesses to fund and give finance to businesses. So we might think it's all just big players like Bill Gates or somebody, or Elon Musk or somebody like this. Yeah, they're involved in financial markets, but people, ordinary, everyday working people are involved as well. Financial markets, just like any other market, the way of bringing buyers and sellers together. And what ends up happening is companies issue debt to financial markets called bonds, corporate bonds. They can issue shares to shareholders as well, okay, to increase their shareholding. That doesn't happen too often. Typically, once the company's up and running, they're more dependent on debt through bonds, on which they have to pay interest on the debt. For example, 10% interest. You're paying an interest rate every single year. Like if you put money in a bank account and you get interest on that money. It's the same kind of idea. It's also worth noting as well, or just thinking as well, we're not concerned with how governments finance themselves really too much in corporate finance. It's not our main goal, you know, it's more of an economics topic. But governments are also big issuers of debt. So governments are doing this all the time through financial markets as well. Something that's called sovereign bonds, government debt. So we can consider it in this way here, the financial markets and the corporation. So just to start here in the financial markets. Okay, financial markets are stock exchanges, bond markets, foreign exchange markets. Okay, what we consider, we think about things like Wall Street in New York. London is a big market. Big capital cities around the world, typically they have their own local financial markets. Basically, we start off at point A here. The business is getting money, cash for debt or shares that the business is issuing to the players in the financial markets. The business is getting money for that. Okay, so it's a way of the business getting finance, getting money. What do they do with that money? We're looking to invest in assets. We're looking to invest in a new machinery, new equipment, new vehicles, maybe invest in giving money to giving credit to our debtors, invest in our current and our non-current assets, invest in buying stock or inventory. Okay, so in our financial accounting, we use the terms current assets and fixed assets or non-current assets. And this is why the business needs this finance, this source of funds. The business, the firm, the corporate invests in these things. We're then hoping, the business is hoping to get some profit out of this, okay, or to get a return on doing this investing. Otherwise, there'd be no point in doing the investing. So cash would flow then, once the business has made some return, cash would flow from the business at point C in the form of, well, dividends back to shareholders and debt payments and interest back to the people who have issued debt or who we've issued debt to up here in point A. So these people are not going to give the money to the business unless they get a return. Okay, in terms of payment of the creditors, current liabilities, non-current liabilities, payment of the debt. Non-current, what does current mean in accounting? Current really means within 12 months, okay? So non-current is beyond just 12 months. So very much this debt is often 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, okay? And the shares as well, the equity shareholders, these need to get what we call a dividend. This is a kind of circular motion here. Who else is taking a cut? We see down here in point D, the tax is going to the government, okay? So when the businesses get the money from these markets, invest in factories, machinery, equipment, stock, then use it, transform it, manufacture something with it, etc., do something with it to generate a return. Some of that return goes to government. Some of that return obviously then goes back to the financial, who provided the finance, the shareholders, the banks, the creditors, so we have to pay back. So if you like, you could consider point A to B to C, you know, and then back to E here, back down to D as well. It goes in that kind of circular motion. Okay, and then once they have more money, they'll start to reinvest up here again at point A. Now, where do these people get the money from? Where do these financial markets get the money from? Yeah, I mean, some cases they're getting the money from Bill Gates or Elon Musk and so on, but also they're getting it from just ordinary households. Either directly from households, with a direct link into financial markets through directly buying shares, for example. But also if the households go through financial institutions like banks that then bring all the money together, pool it all up, and then bring it all together, lots of people's savings, and bring them to the marketplace. Okay, so that is kind of basically how cash flows around the financial markets and the corporate, the business. There's a couple of, it's worth having a quick, having a look at that slide, just consider the various steps here. And who the different players are. And remembering that, you know, individual investors and households, small investors can be involved here as well. Any questions on that? It's a busy enough flow, but it's just on one sheet, one page, what's actually happening. We're not concerned with everything here. We're touching on only parts of this in corporate finance. So we won't be going into these areas in huge detail, but we will see situations where the business gets money and it's got to think what's going to do with the money. What we call investment appraisal. How do we manage the money that the business already has been given? That's a key consideration in corporate finance. One of our big learning objectives in this module is where do we get the money from? Who do we get the money from? Are there different ways of getting the money? What do we do with the money? How do we make sure we have enough money and we're running our working capital well and being liquid? So how this is all developed, it depends on different countries and just sort of different approaches. Different groups of countries have taken historically different approaches. We kind of have loosely kind of general, because there's so much globalization has happened, it's very difficult to tell the difference in some ways now between one country and another almost. But in the past, historically, where we come from, we've had different systems. We've had more bank-based systems where banks play a major role in providing the finance to organizations and are being very dominant stakeholders, to other countries having what we call more a market-based system, where there's more link between maybe the individual investors and individual households and the organization, and less involvement of the bank in the middle, if you like. Okay, as a financial intermediary, acting between the individual over here, let's say, and the business over here. Maybe a more direct link, okay, instead of going through banks and financial institutions. And this is quite general, okay, because different countries will have a mix. But we have sort of seen certain countries are more favoring bank-based systems historically, especially places like Italy, some of the Germany, Austria, some of the Central European countries, some of the Middle Eastern countries, Arabian countries, in Egypt and so on, are more bank-based systems historically, where banks were very, very important. Not that they're not important in other countries as well. Examples of market-based systems are more countries like the UK, the US in particular, Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Singapore in Asia, a lot of Asian countries, Hong Kong, where there is maybe not so much reliance on the bank playing a key role, but actually individual investors linking more directly with the firms that they're investing in. And one of the things we've seen in studies about this is that with these market-based systems like the US and the UK, we see Singapore, there may be more focus on short-term returns, because people are just looking for, the investors are more direct, and they're looking for a very, very quick return back. Whereas in bank-based systems, maybe there is more of a longer-term view, which in many ways is a better, more stable way of investing. To have not just considering first couple of years, I need to make a quick buck. Like in America, a real kind of American culture in a way, you're going to make a real quick turnaround, a real quick buck, but more long-term investing. We might have seen historically in these more bank-based economies, and in some ways they're more stable investing environments. And some people might say they're more boring investing environments, and these are more dynamic. As I say, they're quite general in a way, because especially now with globalization, there's been more of a merging. So that, we can't maybe say like we used to, a certain country is just one particular way. It's now more of a hybrid, if you like. Okay, so that moves us along to something called corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is something we will have seen and will come across quite a lot. As I said earlier, you will find that businesses are very quick to tell us how great they are as social and corporate citizens. Okay, corporate social responsibility is something we've seen over the last couple of years, decade, 2 decades in particular. It's kind of moved more into something called ESG, but corporate social responsibility is just part of ESG. It basically puts a lot of stress on the obligations of the organization to the community, the wider stakeholders. So you'll see this all of the time. Every time you open up Twitter and Facebook and these things, you know, it doesn't take that long before we start finding a company telling us how they have contributed to the environment or done something for the environment or for social causes. And that's basically part of what corporate social responsibility has been driving. So particularly with respect to charitable, social, economic stewardship. So a couple of stories I've seen. I mean, you will see your own examples of this. You will have seen this as consumers. You consume something, you look at things, companies, how they're behaving on the internet and social media and so on. You see what they're doing on YouTube ads. You see what they're doing on television. You know, you will see examples of this. Few examples I've seen over the last number of years. Little supermarkets, they had a thing where they had vegetables and fruit in the supermarket, some of which used to get wasted because it wasn't the right shape or a certain color, and that was a big waste. So some pressure was put on them, I suppose, really, from charities and communities to say, why are you throwing out so much reasonably good food every day? So they had a scheme of avoiding that in the farm, basically. When they go to grade the vegetables and the fruit in the farm, however they're doing in a machine, you know, potatoes and carrots and so on. You know, when they were doing it at that particular point, they didn't just bring the fruit and vegetables that didn't fit a certain size or color. They didn't just bring them, transport them all the way to the shop and then throw them out, transport them all the way to a warehouse. Right there at that point where they were grading them, they were distributing them straight from there into charities or out to charities, so that somebody could make some use of those particular fruit and vegetables. Somebody gets some use out of them. And it was a way of cutting down on waste, basically, you know. And of course, the company's very quick to tell us that they wanted, you know, people to know that they were doing this as part of their corporate social responsibility. So that's an example of it. I mean, it is true that, you know, there was nothing wrong with this fruit and veg. It's just it didn't look a certain way. Because supermarkets spend a bit of time, you know, on the look of things, how things look. But there was absolutely nothing wrong with this food. You know, it's just it didn't fit their rules for how it would look, so they make sure it was being used somewhere. And then Co-op Supermarket doesn't operate in Ireland, but operates in Britain and the UK, and they were very quick to introduce. They were a very ethical type of business in terms of how they behave themselves historically, and they were very quick to bring in shopping bags that were environmentally friendly, that would degrade well, that, you know, had no plastics, nothing to be recycled. So they weren't like just the reusable bags, they weren't plastic bags, but they were made of natural components or natural fiber, and they could degrade very quickly. And they were, you know, cheap as well, and so on. So that was another example of corporate social responsibility. So it wasn't really the government telling them, you must do this. Although the government would set, you know, limits and they will tell people generally what to do and have rules and regulations. But companies are kind of more volunteering to do this. Because you see benefits of corporate social responsibility in terms of enhancing their brand, keeping employees happy, okay, or having more motivated employees. So delivering business performance through happier, more committed employees. Happier customers are happier that they're shopping maybe in an ethical supermarket or a company that has some kind of social awareness and being a corporate citizen. Or they may choose to say, I don't want to shop in that supermarket anymore because I don't see them doing this. some consumers will be happier to go with a company that is following a corporate social responsibility program and influencing the overall business strategy. So actually driving the overall plans of the business at the highest levels and the future plans of the business. So there's an actual change in how the people at the top think when they're setting the strategy. So there is something called a continuum over the last number of years. This is kind of developed. This is what I mean by businesses sort of going out and saying, look at us, you know, we are active and we're not just being what we call reactive. So at the very start, businesses kind of had to be forced into this. Minimum legal compliance, minimum laws by the government, kind of government pushing them with a stick kind of thing to do it. Over time, though, the culture of the organization changes and you get a corporate culture change, culture shift, and the business starts to behave naturally, okay? Instead of being told by the government or told by the United Nations to do things a certain way, they start to behave this way themselves, naturally. They're not reactive, but they're more active. They start to act with more conviction about being a good corporate citizen. To then get to a more mature stage, which is where some businesses are at now, where they are completely committed to this, and it's part of their way of thinking, and they're immediately thinking when they're set up to do something new or launch a new product or launch a new service, they're immediately thinking, what's the corporate social responsibility impact of this? Okay, have we thought about corporate social responsibility? So they're a lot more active and proactive, what we call proactive, okay? And this is kind of the phase where businesses are moving into something called ESG. Now, ESG is just economic, social, and governance. So it is leading on. It's not like some new thing that came from nowhere. It's very much leading on from corporate governance and corporate social responsibility. And ESG is very much something that came down from the UN, from the United Nations in particular. They've been very much driving this. So ESG is economic, environmental, social, and governance. It's a recent framework considering business sustainability. It leads on from CSR, from corporate social responsibility, environmental concerns, and developments in governance. We do have to be realistic about these things and the demands of it, okay? So businesses are trying to change their behaviors, but it does take a bit of time. Resources are not unlimited. We don't have unlimited amounts of money or time. We do have various objectives. The stakeholders, the shareholders will be part of the stakeholders. Shareholders may come in and say, we're not happy with you spending so much money on this, or we can't afford you to do all of these corporate social responsibility programs. I mean, there is a cost to this in money. It's not free. The consumers, the customers can end up paying more of the cost. So consumers might turn around and say, I don't mind you doing some of this, but not if the price of your product is going to increase massively. So there are, as usual, things with management. It's not just, you know, a dreamland where there's no, it's very easy, we'll just go off and do everything we want to do. And we have unlimited amounts of money flowing around. We've got to think, where's the money coming from as well? We've got to think of the competing stakeholders, you know, and there will be backwards and forwards. It's not always one way where it's just, okay, we just follow what the environmental group has told us to do. We've got to think, is it practical? Are we going to be able to do this? Is it going to run us into debt? Is it going to run us into huge losses? You know, there's no point in having businesses that are run out of business because the employees start losing jobs, customers start losing their service, the government starts losing its tax. So, and that's the thing with government as well, is that they are actually, you know, they're always, of course, under pressure from electorates and voters and so on, but they also have to think about the tax revenue they're getting coming in. So they need the businesses to be profitable. Has anyone come across any of this ESG or corporate social responsibility? Any examples of this? Anybody on Zoom? Anyone here? You must have seen something somewhere, some ad or something.
Well, I don't know if there is the best example, but Rolex was owned by a person, right? And
Okay, Rolex, the watchmaking.
yes,
Yeah,
but now is fully owned by
a charity.
a charity, so it's a non-profit. But anyways, all the profit goes directly to social causes.
Right. That's a nothing. That's a new development. Somebody said that to me last week as well. It's obviously just in the news in the last week or two. Rolex, the watchmaking company. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're not just concerned with the existing shareholders. Well, the existing shareholders got out of it, presumably. If they've set it up as a charity. Yeah.
A lot of these, well, Chile is a very famous country because of the mining activity, right?
Right.
And a lot of these mining companies, they have social responsibility, like they give back to the community, like different courses. So if you want to work there, but you don't have any education or anything, they give you the training that you need for
Okay.
free, and then they see you are able.
Right. So they're training people in order for them to then work for the company and the mining company. Yeah.
Yeah, if they are able to make the,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's kind of helping community and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, there is some other companies, schools for the local community, whatever.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, absolutely. The mining companies, Rolex, becoming a charity. Anybody online? Anyone on Zoom? Any other examples that didn't come across of this? There seems to be a thing about setting up charities. So I heard this morning on the news, there's this clothing company, Patagonia, which I don't think is it from Patagonia in Argentina. I
Yeah.
think it's from, I think they're American, which,
Yeah, it is. Isn't it?
but they're called Patagonia.
I think the owner was really keen on Patagonia. He really
Right,
liked
Patagonia, yeah.
people like
Yeah.
that.
But the owner of that, the person who set it up, he's turned it into a charity as well now today. I saw that was only in the news this morning.
Yeah,
I heard that.
I heard that. And then the Tom, but they just, when you buy something, you give a pair of shoes to like the most
Right.
poor.
Yeah. I think they had a history, that Patagonia had a history of a lot. They were very advanced in corporate social responsibility.
There is a book, the name is Let My People Surf. It's the history about Patagonia.
That company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, this guy, he like surfing, skimboard, stuff like that. He went to Patagonia to do some sports. And the company based on its clothes, but part of the company is to help the environment because he likes like
Yeah.
environment, clean energy, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And for example, if you have something to fix like a jacket, if you go to the shop and ask for their help, they will help you because the idea is not to,
Keep buying.
yeah, not to get a clothes and just throw away
Right.
to protect the environment.
Yeah.
And they say it's better to fix it
Okay.
than to throw away a new jacket.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to fix.
Right. From the environmental point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think 10% or 50% they donate to help environments
Yeah.
organization, non-organization. That's the idea of the time.
Kind of the opposite of the mining company then, in a way. So, yeah, that
Yeah,
was,
most of consumers of Patagonia, they buy because the history behind it's not only because the products.
yeah,
To
yeah,
help, like the idea of to help the environment.
right. Well, today it was in the news that he is kind of out of it as a shareholder, and it's been set up as a charity. That's a big development then, obviously. That's two companies in the last 2 weeks. Rolex, which I'm a bit surprised with.
Rolex is from 1960s. That is a charity.
It's a charity since then.
Yeah, 1960.
And I thought it was only in the news this week.
Yeah, because kind of people discovered it, but it's been charity. for
Right. Okay.
a long time. Well, but what is it really social responsibility? And how much is about taxes really?
Tax. Okay. Yeah, people can be a bit cynical sometimes about companies' corporate social responsibility.
Really? Corporate social responsibility? What is it about?
Is there a way? Is it some kind of a tax relief thing? You know, some people can be a bit cynical about how, especially when they all of a sudden, all these companies, all of a sudden, because we've seen a huge increase in the last 10 years, 5 years. If they can't wait to tell us, you know, in their marketing campaigns, and so sometimes people are a bit cynical about, you know, well, I'm not sure, you know. And they behave, you know, the reason why they're doing this in some cases is because they were behaving badly in the past, you know. Okay, good, thanks. So in summary, corporate finance, what we're looking at in the module here, financing the firm's activities. So we're not going to be focusing on these sort of softer framework environmental issues, if you like, in future weeks. Going to get more into the finance. How do we make the best financial decisions? Primarily for the company shareholders. We still consider company shareholders, we're making decisions for them in a private organization. But it's important to understand the background, the environment, the corporate social responsibility when considering this decision-making process. We're going to have a look at the Enron case study in a minute, but before we do, just to focus on a couple of areas. This corporate governance, how businesses run themselves, has changed in the last number of years, and it sort of comes in what's called a code of practice, which is, in theory, is voluntary, okay? Voluntary for a company to follow, but it's not a government saying you must do this particular law, but becomes quickly the done thing or the accepted thing for companies. And particularly focus on the top level, the board of directors up at the very top, making sure that they are taking responsibility. They're paid the most money. They're not there just to sit in board meetings and play golf and so on, and get paid lots of money. They are actually meant to be the key decision makers and be responsible for how the business is behaving. Because sometimes in the past we found top directors where they felt they were just there to make money, and somebody else's problem, you know, if something goes wrong. So, you know, it's basically making sure that directors are more responsible in their roles, which is very important because they have, under law, they do have actually that responsibility. Making sure they have the right skills and the performance is measured on an ongoing annual basis. Making sure they have proper procedures, the company's proper procedures for nominating. So we have a formal process or procedure for nominating new directors. So it's not just bringing in our friends, quick phone call, I get my friend in to become the new chief executive, but we have to go through a formal process, proper interviews and so on. That's all part of corporate governance. We should have some division responsibilities at the top of an organization between what's known as the chairman or the chairperson or chairwoman of the board, which is a key role in a company, running the board meetings at the top. That should not be the same person who's the managing director or the chief executive officer. And very often in the past, these have been the same person. And what we found is that one person is dominating things too much. Okay, this improvement in corporate governance has also said that we need to bring in more independent, what are called non-executive directors. These are people at the top management who don't do day-to-day management, but come in from outside. Now, typically these are from people from the industry. In the past, they were executives, chief executives themselves, or they could be academic professors in a university or something, you know, that have a lot of experience. And they come in once a month. They don't work day to day in the organization. They come in once a month as non-executive directors called NEDs. and they should be involved in setting pay and bonuses primarily, and also in the remuneration the nomination committee, or nominating new executives coming into the organization. So we get away from this sort of maybe little group. We've the risk of little groups forming at the top that are dominant, and that we're just looking after our friends, and we have basically corruption, if you like. So in corporate finance, we've got three main areas we're going to be concerning ourselves with in future weeks: capital budgeting, so spending money, investing in the future. So the company spends money, there's a flow of cash out of the organization. The structure of the capital, where do we get the money from? The sources of finance, where does the business get money from? Its sources of finance. How can the firm finance its decisions? And then how do we manage our day-to-day financial activities, working capital management? How do we make sure we have enough cash available to run the business? Really, our main objective is that the goal of financial management in a private business is for maximization of shareholder wealth. But we have to be aware of these other things we talked about today: corporate social responsibility, corporate governance, the wider stakeholders, and ESG, environment, social and governance issues. Now, there is a little appendix there at the back of the notes this week for you to have a look at, just in terms of the various stakeholders and sort of information they may get. So I ask you to read that yourself in your own time. What I want to do, folks, is I want to now spend 10 minutes looking at the case study we have up under week 2. In the final 10 minutes of the class, it's called the Enron case study, and it's up under week 2 of the module in the Moodle page. And it's not that long to read. I would ask the folks who are online to please read that case study there, called the Enron case study. And then I will ask you to feed back. Let's have a little bit of discussion before we finish. For the folks in the room, so for the folks who are online, please have a look at this case study. And then I'm okay. So Franklin, thanks for that on the chat. So just thinking about what we've been reading there. If you haven't quite got to finish it, you can have a look at it. It's always there on the lecture 2 notes. There's some part you want to go back over because it's a good little story to sort of, this is a real company in America and California, to understand poor corporate governance. Franklin, thanks. The mistake was to go overseas without concerning different regulations, to lose the lead of the main gas, product gas. Yeah, so this is an example of them maybe dominated by a certain ego and empire building, and it just made mistake after mistake. And instead of just focusing maybe on their main product, as you correctly say, Franklin, exactly, they started going off into other things, intermediating customers. The contracts obviously weren't as good as they thought they were going to be. Thanks. Yeah. Any other? Growing assets at the same time, expanding overseas and diversifying the portfolio. They're growing too much too quickly. Any other observations or thoughts about that story? It was a big failure, led to a lot of changes in the law in America as well, something called Sarbanes-Oxley in Washington had to be passed, and it's a big failure of a business. Any other thoughts? Who do you think lost out?
Stakeholders.
Government?
Stakeholders, the government, the workforce,
The workforce, yeah.
the shareholders.
Shareholders lost everything, you know.
Mhm.
In 2001, Enron filed for the biggest bankruptcy the USA had seen. It was still a very big, large bankruptcy, meaning that the shareholders lost all the money. So that's what I'm saying, mean about, the shareholders, they need some protection. There is a reason why we focus on shareholder value and shareholder wealth and a return to shareholders, because they lost their money. In some cases, People would have lost savings, life savings nearly, you know. Employees would have lost jobs. Suppliers and customers would have had losses because of it. And it also brought down one of the biggest accounting firms in the world called Arthur Andersen, who were very, very old, very well regarded audit and accounting firm before that, and their business was destroyed because they were meant to be doing some checking on. They were meant to be checking on what Enron was doing, and they clearly weren't, you know. Any other points? If you can quite get to finish reading it, please do in your own time, or go back and reread again, because it's a worthwhile case study. And it's always up there on the Moodle page. There's a couple of questions I put up on Moodle for you to just have a look at, just for your own reflection, revision in your own work. We'll have a quick look at some solutions next week. Just a couple of quick questions around value for money, public services, management objectives, and corporate social responsibility. We'll see you next week. Thanks, folks. 9 o'clock Thursday morning.
Thanks, Declan.
Thanks. Take care. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.